When you allow someone to become this wealthy, and then you allow them to turn that wealth into political power through philanthropy, and then you praise them for exercising this unregulated power, it's a really destructive model of oligarchy. And, we should deal with the problem as it exists around Bill Gates. So we don't need to deal with this problem with Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, the next generation of tech oligarchs that are coming.
Welcome back to In the Meanwhile. I'm Nora Kenworthy. Marcus is off this week, but an episode we did in March became super relevant again this week, so we thought we'd bring it back for another listen. Earlier this week, billionaire philanthropist Bill Gates testified before a closed hearing of Congress on his relationship and ties to Jeffrey Epstein. Also this week, the New York Times reported on the panic at the White House over the Epstein Files, which included Trump administration officials calling for highly secret meetings in the White House Situation Room to try to manage the fallout from the scandal. Legendary ABC White House correspondent Sam Donaldson compared the Epstein Files to Nixon's Watergate scandal. And of course, Trump is not the only high-profile figure implicated in these files. This goes further than just a very corrupt presidency. So, in this episode, we speak with Tim Schwab, author of The Bill Gates Problem, about what the connection between Gates and Epstein reveals about billionaire philanthropy, inequality, and power in our current society. And before we get back to that earlier and lengthy conversation, I called up Tim Schwab this week to ask him what he was thinking about from the hearing and how he thinks things have changed since we last spoke. So we'll hear from him in conversation with me today, and then we'll go back to that earlier conversation. Well, Tim, thank you so much for being willing to chat with us once again about the events of this week. I know you've been following this story very closely for months now. We don't know a great deal about what was discussed behind closed doors at the House Oversight Committee hearing with Gates earlier this week. But we do have this opening statement from Gates that sort of states that, he never witnessed anything. He didn't know that Epstein was engaging in criminal conduct. I was never interested in a relationship with him. Given what you know from your reporting, how credible do you find these claims?
Yeah, I don't think they're really credible at all because if you go back now that we have the Epstein files with the benefit of these thousands of documents, you can see direct correspondence between Bill Gates and Jeffrey Epstein. You can see, and also if you go back into the archives, at the time that Bill Gates and Jeffrey Epstein were first meeting, Jeffrey Epstein was already a registered sex offender who had served time in prison for a sex crime involving a minor. It was a public record about this crime. It was very, very well documented in the news media as well. So to me, it just doesn't hold up, his account that he's just claiming ignorance. But it's a claim we often hear from men who are caught up in the Epstein scandal saying like, well, yeah, I met him a few times, but it was very innocent. So, I think that he does have a major credibility problem. And I think that is leaking over to the Gates Foundation and legitimacy there also.
Right. Yeah, which is something I want to pick up with you. I mean, as you also point out, Gates had the benefit of like an army of people at the foundation and handling his personal business who could have easily done a Google search for Epstein's name and quickly figured out who he was. But let's get to the broader questions of what this means for the foundation as an institution, but also for how we think about philanthropic foundations and their place in our society and our kind of power architecture. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, it's hard to say what the future holds, but my great hope is that this, as Congress is looking into the Gates Foundation's relationship with Epstein, that this could open the door to a larger reappraisal of philanthropy. So Congress hasn't taken a hard look at philanthropy since 1969. And it's very long overdue. I've been talking to tax scholars for years who say that the IRS, Congress, they really need to radically revise. I mean, if you look at the way philanthropy operates today, like look at the fact that the Gates Foundation was collaborating with someone like Jeffrey Epstein. It's like the way that the Gates Foundation is often operating is so distant from your and my definition of charity. It's really time for a new set of rules and regulations. And what's interesting is that Warren Buffett, this multi-billionaire, huge philanthropist, longtime donor to the Gates Foundation, he recently also came to the same conclusion that he thinks that the Epstein scandal could provoke Congress to suddenly create new rules and regulations over private foundations. It's very much needed, I'd say. And I think we're just more generally, more globally, I guess, we are long overdue to think about, is society, is humanity, is the economy served by having these mega foundations? Like the Gates Foundation is $89 billion, and it's using that money to shape public policy on artificial intelligence, on climate change, on global health, on public education. It really is an unregulated political actor, and it has huge resources at its disposal to really put, Bill Gates' very narrow political worldview into action. So I think this
Mhm.
is, if it takes a scandal like Jeffrey Epstein to bring about this kind of more global reappraisal, then so be it.
Right, and as you noted in your writing this week, these sort of mega philanthropies also have a very acute interest in continuing to exercise that sort of unregulated power, right? So you leave readers in your piece this week with a kind of warning of like, don't underestimate Bill Gates or his desire to like keep a stranglehold on the narrative. Is there anything else you want to say about that?
I do think it's important to say you shouldn't underestimate Gates. He's one of the wealthiest and most powerful people in the world. But I will say I have been very interested to see the news media. I'm always watching how other journalists cover the Gates Foundation, especially like large legacy mainstream news outlets. And
Mhm.
outlets like the Wall Street Journal are really
Yeah.
going after Gates, which is really great to see. I mean, it's long overdue, and they're not seeing anything earth shattering, but they're noticing that the Gates Foundation is really embattled at this moment and in a really state of institutional crisis. So I
Mhm.
think the Epstein scandals turn out to be hugely consequential for the future of the Gates Foundation. I've called for the removal of Bill Gates and all of the board members because they've just allowed this scandal to go on and done nothing for so long. Um, but I think the best hope of some kind of accountability is really going to come from the outside, like if Congress does take a hard look.
Mhm.
So, I'll be looking forward to the transcript that's released from Gates's closed door interview. But news reports are that it was almost 6 hours in length. So there should be a lot there to look at.
One might hope there's some substance there.
I hope so. Yeah.
Um, and as you've been really careful at pointing out over and over again, this isn't just a scandal that involves Bill Gates, but it's a scandal that really went to the heart of the Gates Foundation. I mean, you write about how Epstein was allegedly bringing victims to meetings at the foundation. How do you see this as an implication not just of Gates and his personal foundation, but an implication of this broader foundation that he's sort of built up in his name, but of course is like a many-headed dragon that has a lot of influence?
Yeah, and this is the counterpoint I would say to I'm saying the news media is doing a better job, but I do think they are trading in some false narratives, like this idea that we shouldn't let the personal behavior of the reckless behavior of Bill Gates in any way reflect on the good work of the Gates Foundation. And I
Mm,
think that's a fiction. I think it's a dangerous fiction because if you go into the Epstein files, as I have, you see many different people at the Gates Foundation at all different levels interacting with Epstein. There's meetings, there's correspondence, there's hundreds of messages going back and forth. There's a real institutional relationship. So at every level where people were looking at Jeffrey Epstein and collaborating with the Gates Foundation, everything we can see, it was always green lights from everybody involved. So, this idea that we're going to get rid of Bill Gates and that the Gates Foundation's magically going to be, fixed, it just doesn't add up to me because there's so much sort of institutional inertia. So much of the culture of that place is Bill Gates. It's
mm.
how he thinks, it's how he acts, it's how he organizes, it's how he ran Microsoft also. So I do think that it's an institutional problem and there really needs to be institutional consequences. And this gets back into this idea of Congress could take a really big look at the Gates Foundation in particular and these billionaire philanthropies more generally.
Well, Tim, thanks so much for helping us understand this moment. And I have a feeling it may not be the last time we speak to you about this issue if Congress has anything to do about this.
I hope not. I love when I get to speak with you all. So thank you so much.
All right. Thanks so much. So, without further ado, then, let's listen back to this incredibly important and timely conversation with Tim Schwab.
Hello and welcome back to In the Meanwhile. I am Marcus Harrison Green.
And I am Nora Kenworthy. And look, we would totally understand if you felt like this week was one giant doom scroll designed to swallow everything else whole. And that, unfortunately, may actually be the point. Some people have pointed out that it's worth asking whether this is Operation Epic Fury or Operation Epstein Be Forgotten.
The through line here is men, and it's let's just be real, it's men with obscene power choosing targets for destruction the way they pick from the dollar menu. You know, it's violence that covers up violence and abuse distracting from abuse.
And I mean, the silver lining here is I think many of us are not fooled. We are not distracted. We are capable of holding multiple horrors to be true at once. And we are, thank goodness, starting to see some consequences for some of the worst abusers who were named in the Epstein files, most of them in other countries. Former Prince Andrew, a former Norwegian prime minister, a former British ambassador to the US. And also closer to home, people like Larry Summers, who I honestly thought could never get himself fired from a job. Also, alongside him, Peter Attia and Casey Wasserman have all resigned from prominent positions.
Yeah, let's hope they stay resigned. They, there's a sneaky way that these people have of returning from the dead, shall we say. Anyway, I will say there is one highly prominent figure who has faced almost no consequences besides a tepid apology tour and some very unconvincing public explanations. This person has denied many accusations, but acknowledged others, including ongoing affairs with two Russian women.
Okay, see, you use the words apology and acknowledged, Marcus. So I know that we're not talking about Trump.
Alas, no. I guess that gave it away. That being said, today we are talking about another billionaire, and he is an actual one, not just lying about it. Anyway, he has been someone who has been, nearly untouchable here in the United States. It's Bill Gates, folks. We will, we'll sans the suspense. Bill Gates, the co-founder of Microsoft, co-founder and current chair of the Gates Foundation, and America's favorite nerd turned billionaire philanthropist.
Of course, Bill Gates has denied these allegations and insisted that he was not involved in anything illegal. Um, but these are tough topics for us to discuss, particularly as people who live and work in his hometown of Seattle. So, to help us unpack this knot of prestige and power, we are bringing in none other than Tim Schwab, an investigative journalist who has been studying Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation for many years. He's author of the book, The Bill Gates Problem: Reckoning with the Myth of the Good Billionaire, which received an editor's choice designation from the New York Times and has been published in 7 languages. Schwab's award winning reporting has appeared in numerous outlets, including The Nation, the British Medical Journal, the Columbia Journalism Review, The Baffler, and others. Well, Tim, thank you so much for being with us today. This feels like a really long overdue conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's so exciting to share my findings and arguments with Seattle.
Yes, and we are excited to platform them. So we're gonna jump right into the deep end. I'm actually not sure there's a shallow end on this story. As many people know by now, Bill Gates features heavily in the Epstein files. And as you have been documenting, Gates has repeatedly changed his story regarding Epstein, offering half truths and omissions to explain away the relationship over several years. Gates seems to be embarking on somewhat of a apology, or maybe it's better termed an explanation tour. Um, as he does that, what do you want people to keep in mind as they hear about his history with Epstein and hear his attempts to sort of explain it away?
I think that we should be holding Bill Gates to the same standard we're holding all of these other men and women who have come out in the Epstein files as having been associates with Jeffrey Epstein. You know, Bill Gates did not start associating with Jeffrey Epstein until after he had already had a felony conviction for a sex crime involving a minor. So that makes him somewhat unique among the many names that have come out in the Epstein files. You know, he was a registered sex offender. His crime had been widely covered by the news media, even after he got out of prison. At the same time that Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation was meeting with him, the press continued to report on new, very troubling allegations about Epstein. Um, so it's just very hard to believe the kind of ignorance excuse that he's using now, which is that he didn't really understand what a monster Epstein was and he should have looked more into it, but that ultimately he's innocent because he wasn't involved with any of the victims. His mistake was simply of choosing to meet with Epstein and to share some of his philanthropic halo with Epstein, which gave him, entree into polite society and into elite philanthropy. Even if that is the only extent of his interaction with Epstein, and I think that is an open question because of some of the other things that have come out. Even if that is, that's still an incredibly reckless and outrageous decision for this extremely wealthy and powerful philanthropy to associate itself with a convicted sex offender, with somebody who we know anywhere he went, wherever he was, there were so many red flags coming up. The fact that he was always bringing young women with him to his meetings, including his meetings with Bill Gates. So I guess my point is, I think there's a people want to give Gates the benefit of the doubt right now because they always want to give Gates the benefit of the doubt because he's our philanthropist in chief. He's given away tens of billions of dollars, and there's a lot of people, a lot of institutions that depend on that money. A lot of people's lives depend on that money. So it's people have an incentive, I think, to rationalize or to give him the benefit of the doubt because of all the goodwill he's built up over the decades through his tens of billions of dollars in donations. And because, frankly, I think many individuals and institutions have their own financial incentives to keep the money flowing. Um, so I guess that's sort of my big picture. Does that get at your question?
Yeah, and I was gonna say, Tim, I mean, you talk about that philanthropic halo that Epstein sort of, was under with Gates, but Gates himself used philanthropy to sort of launder his own reputation as a very ruthless monopolist. I'm old enough to remember when I think it was under the Clinton administration at the time when the Justice Department was going to break up Microsoft for some monopolistic tactics that didn't end up happening, but at the same time, I mean, I think it spoke to sort of the ruthless nature, at least business wise, of Bill Gates at the time. And so I do want to ask: were these two, meaning Gates and Epstein, more close alike than maybe we would have thought, prior to the release of these Epstein files?
Yeah, I think these absolutely are parallel stories, and they both track along this idea of, these two embattled figures, public figures. Bill Gates at the turn of the millennium, as you said, he was one of the most disliked, one of the most reviled public figures on earth because he was the face of this monopolistic company, Microsoft, and people were throwing pies in his face, and The Simpsons was lampooning him. And it was at that moment of all this controversy and scandal that Bill Gates announces he's going to give away all of his wealth. And it wasn't immediate, but incrementally over the next few years, certainly about a decade later, he'd given away all these billions of dollars. He'd really did a 180 degree in his reputation from one of the most reviled public figures to one of the most admired public figures. And I do think that Jeffrey Epstein was following Bill Gates's blueprint to a T. He came out of that felony sex crime conviction involving a minor. He knew he could see that Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation, what he had done to transform his reputation, what other industry tycoons have done over the decades, over the last century, to use the philanthropy to sort of, launder their reputations. And that is a really key part of the Jeffrey Epstein story is his use. So he was an extremely wealthy financier. He died with about $500 million of personal wealth. And he was this kind of great philanthropist during his time. He gave away a lot of money to sciences, to the arts. And a lot of that was him trying to launder his reputation, to position himself inside polite society, inside elite society. So I do think that there absolutely is a parallel track there. And I think that is what really binds men like Epstein and Gates is like they're both extremely wealthy and they were both using philanthropy to try to burnish their reputations.
I mean, I think you've written pretty clearly, in addition, Tim, that it's not just that Bill Gates was deciding to give away a large portion of his wealth, but in fact, that he was using his wealth to buy power and prestige, influence in foreign governments, in our own government, to shape large sectors of our world to his will. Um, and I guess I feel like there's a moment that the broader US is having right now with the Epstein Files, in which we're really reckoning with not just what they reveal about the horrific crimes that were committed against young girls, but also what they reveal more broadly about how power and privilege and exploitation have really been leveraged by an interrelated group of billionaires.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe one of the big lessons of Jeffrey Epstein, it's not about this sociopathic con man. It's not about a few bad apples. It's about the very destructive nature of extreme wealth itself. When we allow people to become this obscenely wealthy, we know that they will how they'll use the money, which was for their own benefit. It allows them to participate in legislative matters and lobbying matters and campaign contributions in judicial matters at a categorically different way than you or I could because we don't have this extreme wealth. So, in many ways, once you're at this level of wealth, you can act as though, certainly, I think we've seen this with people like Jeffrey Epstein and Bill Gates, is you can act as though the normal rules don't apply to you. And in many practical respects, the rules don't apply to you. Um, there is a lot of discussion about, right now, people are using the word oligarchy in the American political discourse now. There's a growing, I think, appreciation for how destructive extreme wealth is to society, to our economy. But I would say what Epstein and Gates present us is also this illustration of how bad extreme wealth is for our humanity. Um, I think it's bad for the individuals themselves, for Bill Gates and Jeffrey Epstein themselves. They lose some of their humanity when they become so extremely rich. They start to behave in these really, incredibly egregious manners that it's hard for us when we read these emails, when we're reading these documents, to really understand how anyone could get to the point where they would feel like it would be acceptable to behave in this way. I hope I've spent a lot of my recent years as a writer writing about Bill Gates, but it's really always has hopefully been as a case study for this larger problem of extreme wealth. When you allow someone to become this wealthy, and then you allow them to turn that wealth into political power through philanthropy, and then you praise them for exercising this unregulated power, it's a really destructive model of oligarchy. And we should deal with the problem as it exists around Bill Gates, so we don't need to deal with this problem with Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, the next generation of tech oligarchs that are coming.
Yeah, if only. I mean, yeah, to your point, I mean, there's, several studies that have shown that, as wealth increases, particularly to an obscene amount, that there is a decrease in compassion and empathy and even, pro-social behavior. And I think that, as to your point, Tim, I think that is bearing out in this case. That being said, recently, Melinda French, uh, Bill Gates' former spouse, went on NPR and dis- she discussed, briefly about the fact that this was had been a marriage that she had wanted to leave, and that one of the contributing factors to that desire to leave her marriage was her then husband's dealings with Epstein. And there's an allegation, that emerged from the Epstein files that Bill Gates had actually secretly given Melinda drugs for an STD he gave her. And yet, I want to stress it is an allegation. But that being said, to what extent do you see that incident as reflective of the untransparent and unaccountable culture you described Gates bringing to much of his work at the foundation?
Yeah, and maybe it's useful just to talk about what some of these allegations are that have come up in the Epstein files. So we know, and we have known since 2019, that Bill Gates knew Jeffrey Epstein. They've met many times. Bill Gates has always refused to say the exact number of times that they've met, which is like a major red flag when somebody, if there's nothing to hide, if you're just a humanitarian and if you're innocently involved with Jeffrey Epstein to raise money for philanthropy, as Gates has always claimed, there should be no open questions at this point, but there really are. We also later found out after Bill Gates said that all of his meetings with Epstein were with men. We later found out that Epstein apparently had a habit of bringing young women to his meetings with Gates. And there's pictures of Gates, with his body pressed very closely to these young women with a big smile on his face. These pictures do not look good. The optics are not good. Um, so yeah, and then you had the email that you mentioned, which is a draft email that came out in the Epstein Files. It appears that Epstein was working on a series of draft emails for a disgruntled employee of Bill Gates who was leaving. And these emails contained allegations about Gates having sex with Russian women, having contracted an STD, trying to get antibiotics that he could surreptitiously give to Melinda French Gates, his then wife, for it. So initially, he said that these are like completely false and outrageously absurd or something like that. And then a few days later, he does a town hall meeting with his staff at the Gates Foundation, and he acknowledges that he did have affairs with two Russian women and that Jeffrey Epstein later found out about it. So it's all that to say is that it seems like it's another sort of evolution in the story, to know exactly what's going on or where the truth lies. Well, you asked about accountability, and that's really, I think, the really important issue. You know, why is it that so many other public figures are being forced out of public life, forced to resign from corporate positions, from philanthropic positions? Where is the accountability for Bill Gates? I think I was the first person that I saw in the media that said Bill Gates needs to be removed from the Gates Foundation. Um, you know, where is the outcry from the philanthropic sector, from the humanitarian sector, from the aid sector? This is a private foundation that is one of the loudest voices in reproductive health, in women's and girls' empowerment. Billions of dollars going into aid programs, NGOs, advocacy groups, into media to work on women and gender issues. I mean, it is a fundamental moral conflict to have somebody like Bill Gates as the head of this organization. How long will it be until organizations stop taking the Gates Foundation's money? Um, you know, this accountability, like I said, we've known about Gates's relationship with Epstein since 2019. It's always been sort of like in a cloud of red flags, to mix metaphors. There's always been many questions. There are even more questions now. At what point are you actually going to see some kind of action, either from the board of directors of the Gates Foundation forcing him out, or from the Washington State Attorney General, or from the Internal Revenue System on the federal level, or from Congress, which is already making noise about bringing Gates to Washington, D.C. to talk about his ties to Epstein. So, I mean, I just see now on social media, certainly, I think there's a big outcry and a big outpouring of criticism about both Bill Gates and the Gates Foundation. I mean, in a rational world, this would be an existential crisis. This would be the end of Gates's philanthropic career. But again, you can't underestimate, how much goodwill someone like Bill Gates can buy through the enormous sums of money he has. He's got a personal fortune. I think it's over $100 billion, has been for a long time. He's got his private foundation, which is $86 billion. He is in the job now of giving away money, and that buys a lot of goodwill. But I do think this is a real test of, how long and to what extent can he really evade the kind of accountability we're seeing in other sectors right now.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, I'm really glad you brought up the focus of their work on women and girls, because as someone who kind of sits in the sector of global health and public health, for me, that has always been one of the pieces of their work that has been used most strongly to kind of burnish their reputation, right? I remember when I first moved out to Seattle, I took sort of like an ethnographic trip to the Gates Foundation Visitor Center. And they had an entire room that was dedicated to all of the innovations that they had funded in sexual and reproductive health for women and maternal health. Hearing these stories now coming out of the Epstein files, it's very hard for me to imagine how they recover credibility as a foundation, at least in this area of their work, after these revelations. But I think as you're noting, like, there is also this tremendous public power that Bill Gates and his foundations have. You've written in your book about the phenomenon, I love this term, of the Bill chill, the sort of chilling effect that the Gates' outsized power has on any people or institutions that might be inclined to critique him. Um, I've certainly felt it myself working at the University of Washington. It's sort of a known fact on campus that if you say certain things, like, the higher ups will get a call. Um,
If you criticize Bill Gates or the Gates Foundation, it's not good for your professional development, for your career, right?
yes,
Yeah.
that is the vibe, I would say. Do you see that effect still happening now in the immediate aftermath of this town hall and these other revelations, or do you feel like maybe is the dam beginning to crack a bit here?
I think both things are happening. So, like you, I work in a field that is just inundated with Gates Foundation funding. I work in a field called the news media, journalism. And this is something I've also written about over the years, the hundreds of millions of dollars the Gates Foundation is donating to the news media. And I think donating is really the wrong way to see it. I mean, that's the way the foundation would say. But I don't think this is charity at all. This is not the Gates Foundation giving away money. This is the Gates Foundation buying influence. And so what you'll see is the Gates Foundation will put out a press release talking about how candid Gates is being right now about his ties to Epstein. And that will be the lead. That'll be the headline and the lead of the article. Where I think, any independent, rational person can see what's happening and you see, no, the real story is the lack of candor. Is the many red flags and question marks that still hound the Gates Epstein scandal, and that I think, again, in a rational world, should have him removed from the foundation. Um, yeah, when I looked at University of Washington, people should read Marcus's recent great piece in The Stranger. Marcus, I can't remember the number you cited to University of Washington Gates Foundation giving, like $750 million or something like that.
I think it was total since at least since 2017 was 1.25 billion.
Okay, 1.2.
Yeah.
If you look at, because there's a whole other sum of money that's going to the University of Washington Foundation, which is a private foundation that's basically there's no I mean, there is a legal separation from the University of Washington, but if you put all the money together, it's closer to $2 billion that the Gates Foundation has given to UW. So it's a huge sum of money. It's probably actually much more than that he's giving through contracts that aren't reported. But so $2 billion, that buys a lot of goodwill. And I think that does create what you call the Bill chill. I didn't invent this term. It's a term that a lot of people use. I can't know for certain who I should give credit to for coining that, but it's this chilling effect. It's once you are if you work in a field like global health, or if you work as a journalist writing about public health or global health, or the other areas where the Gates Foundation works, where agricultural development in Africa, or contraceptive access in poor nations, or public education in the United States. If you work in these fields, the Gates Foundation doesn't have absolute power, but it can exercise very substantial power over research, over advocacy, over the media space, because it works in a lot of areas that are very underfunded, where people are really dependent on outside funding, and because it has is giving so much money, there are people who either funded by Gates or don't want to foreclose on a future opportunity to get funding from Gates. So this is a chilling effect that's widely felt, and I think it's been widely talked about among academics in particular. But I could say that it's also alive and well in the news media, and I think in many other areas where the Gates Foundation works. And I think that is, a big reason why we've never had an open, honest debate about the Gates Foundation, because so many of the people and institutions that know the foundation best, that are best positioned to offer a critical view or to play a watchdog, those people are financially tied or compromised in some way to Gates. And this is a story that is particularly, I think, salient in Seattle, where the foundation is based, where the foundation gives a lot of money. When my book came out in 2023, it was covered by the New York Times, the Times of London, the Times of India. It was getting coverage all over the world. Not a single outlet in Seattle covered my book. Went to Town Hall Seattle, invited all the local media. Nobody showed up. So I think that's odd. It's just an odd look. It was surprising to me and disappointing, but maybe it shouldn't have been.
No, it shouldn't have been. I mean, I will tell you, Tim, I remember, I believe this was 2000, it was either 2019 or 2020, and the Gates Foundation, they were giving I get some sort of award, I think it was a humanitarian award to, Indian Prime Minister Narendra, Modi, and I remember there were all types of, protests that were going on around the Gates Foundation at the time because of, his paltry human rights record, and there was no major publication that would cover it or even touch that story. I think, it's a now defunct organization, but the Seattle Globalist was the only one. And so to your point about, the bill chill, it's definitely been in full effect for a while, which, actually brings me to, my story that you, referenced earlier, about, some University of Washington students, you know, wanting the university to remove, Bill Gates's name from, one of the buildings there. I what do you see now, particularly in this current climate where maybe the bill chill is thawing a bit? What type of resistance do you see, not just the students at the University of Washington receiving, but people elsewhere who work for nonprofits who have, taken money in the past, if they want to stand up and say, hey, we don't need this, anymore. We don't, this doesn't align with our this type of, philanthropy doesn't, align with our values anymore. What sort of resistance do you foresee them, receiving?
Um, I think, I mean, one of the more interesting dynamics at play is that internally, I think staff at the Gates Foundation morale is cratering, because all the kind of moral conflict that we're talking about now is very keenly felt among the staff who work there because it's so much a part of their identity. This is a mission-driven organization, humanitarian, as you said, Nora. It's very woman forward, women's empowerment forward. I mean, it's really hard, I think, in terms of legitimacy and credibility. So I do think I am surprised that there hasn't been a public resignation. It may be, one insider cynically told me it's because the Gates Foundation pays so well. People don't want to give that up. But I also know that the foundation has very draconian NDAs, non-disclosure and non-disparagement agreements. So people might feel reluctant to be able to speak out. Um, but I am talking to insiders, the sources that I have, who are very upset with the Gates Foundation. There is a group of partners who work with the foundation, like grantees and contractors, that have already gone public on an anonymous basis, but they've gone public to say that they want a full investigation. They want the investigation to be made public. They want like an autopsy, like what the hell went wrong? How in the world? I mean, this is a part of the story I didn't clearly articulate, but it wasn't just Bill Gates meeting with Jeffrey Epstein. Bill Gates was directing his staff at the Gates Foundation to partner with Jeffrey Epstein to collaborate with him on fundraising money for philanthropy. So you had high level staff at the Gates Foundation for years. Having meetings, having phone calls. You had Jeffrey Epstein scheduled to visit the Gates Foundation's headquarters in Seattle. You have Bill Gates and his colleagues going to New York to visit Jeffrey Epstein's mansion. Um, so this is really an institutional relationship that the Gates Foundation had with Jeffrey Epstein for a number of years, pursuing this fundraising collaboration. It didn't end up panning out, but they still nevertheless spent years of institutional resources, staff time, capacity, thinking about this, planning this. So I do think that it is an institutional problem. It's not just Bill Gates' own bad action, but at every level, the people who were in position to say, this is a really bad idea, I'm not going to go along. You just don't see that. You see all the top people, the top staff at the foundation going along with this. So again, it's not a bad apple narrative. It really is, I think, an institutional problem that really needs institutional accountability.
Yeah, and how chilling to think of, like, I mean, I feel bad for Gates Foundation staff who are asked to meet with a person who, when Melinda French Gates met him on one occasion, she immediately concluded that he was, and I quote, "evil personified," right? And to have to be fielding multiple meetings with a person like that, I think it did put them in a hard position. I am wondering now, you know, you've been you've been calling for accountability and oversight of the Gates Foundation for at least a decade now. Um, If this doesn't cause us to meaningfully hold the foundation and in particular Bill Gates to greater account, what do you think will?
Yeah, it's uh it's a tough question. I feel like it's just like there's so much inclination to give Gates the benefit of the doubt that, like, to indict Gates on anything, you have to have the smoking gun. You have to have 10 eyewitnesses. You have to have video camera footage. It's like, everything we're seeing now with Epstein, all the red flags, the sort of cloud of suspicion, the inconsistencies in his story, the omissions. At what point does it eventually snowball into something that he can't really come back from? And I don't know. That really is, it's like, I guess you could say it's kind of a test of our democracy, of the checks and balances that we have in democracy itself against oligarchy, against the ability of the extremely wealthy people to buy their way out of these problems. Because I do think that, and I think this has kind of been like, the axle in which the foundation has always turned is according to this grim logic of greed and desperation, that as long as our checkbook remains open, it doesn't matter how bad our behavior is. It doesn't matter how um, toxic or caustic or how unseemly our requests are of the world. As long as our checkbook is remains open, people will continue to line up for the money. Um, and, it's also the case that this is happening at a time where the areas in which the Gates Foundation works, global health in particular, you're seeing major cuts in funding from governments around the world. So, the Gates Foundation is particularly powerful because its billions of dollars are that much more important. You can't instead just go to the USAID because USAID doesn't exist anymore. Um, I mean, yeah, and I guess the a takeaway from all of this is just how much liability there is in organizing the health of poor people around a fickle, deeply flawed billionaire in Seattle. It does not make sense to have this guy who really doesn't know much about public health. He's a software guy from Seattle, to have this much power and this much influence that you know hundreds of millions, maybe even billions of people around the globe have come to depend on him to get access to parts of their public health. And we're now in this situation where he could be removed from the Gates Foundation. The priorities could change, his mind could change, or he's getting older too. He's going to die at some point. I mean, it really is a very, very fragile. It's a very unregulated and very undemocratic model of governance or for public health of poor people, and I think it shows. Yeah, and it shows just that. I mean, I think it shows a need for sort of renewed, a public orientation, public funding, and all of these get into like these democratic questions about what kind of world we want to live in. My own view is we have this Bill Gates problem that we ourselves created. It was a political choice to allow him to create this monopoly called Microsoft, and to not regulate it sufficiently. Just like we're making the same political choice with all the new eras of tech oligarchs. We're allowing them to create these incredibly powerful companies, and then which are minting these multi-billionaires. And then we're going to allow these billionaires to put their money into self-serving philanthropy that also launders a reputation, that gives them political power, that gives them major tax benefits. All of these are political decisions, and we can make other political decisions. But that's not easy. And I can't tell you how to get there A to B to C. But I do think that we should be thinking about Bill Gates, the Gates Foundation, and even Jeffrey Epstein in terms of around democracy, and trying to think about restoring democracy. At least that's how I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, well, to your point about, this potentially being, I don't know, in harbinger of a sort of renewed awakening, if you will, around a recalibration of society of like, how are we allowing these folks to sort of have this level of impunity just because they have, X amount of dollars. Like with, I don't want to over romanticize the political process, right? But at the very least, we can ostensibly hold elected officials accountable by voting them out every 2 or 4 years versus an Elon Musk or a Bill Gates or a Jeff Bezos, right? Who are seem to be there in perpetuity these days. And so I guess my larger question for you is this, Tim, is do you think this is a scenario where more and more people will finally wake up to like, hey, this, we've been at, there's that joke about like so many people were mad about the wrong 1% screwing them over, when it comes to immigrants or trans people. It's like, no, it's been the 0.01% all along, and here it is.
Right. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, it's very easy to become fatalistic when you think about how much wealth and how much power these tech oligarchs have in particular. Um, but I don't know what other choice we have than, to borrow Bill Gates' slogan, to be impatient optimists. Not as he is, but kind of in our own way, to have the daring to fight the fatalism that makes us disbelieve another world is possible, because I
Yeah.
don't really know what other choice there is, other than to be optimistic and to really have the daring to imagine that and then to fight for that. I mean, to your point, Marcus, Bill Gates was, people know him as being on the co-founder of Microsoft. And people may have lost track of the fact that in 2020, he was reportedly forced off the board of Microsoft because he faced allegations of misconduct towards females.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
that's happened at the same time that Gates is surrounded by all these allegations with Epstein, is independent of Epstein. Gates is facing a number of other allegations about misconduct towards employees at Microsoft and the Gates Foundation. But at Microsoft, Bill Gates denies that he was forced off because of this allegation. He said it was just his choice, but there have been many independent reports that said he was forced off. And that's what you have with a company that has shareholders, that has a functioning board with checks and balances. Like you said, with somebody like Donald Trump, there hopefully will be an election. We can make different electoral choices. But with somebody like Bill Gates, who just says, I'm a private philanthropist, there's really nothing to hold him accountable, really checks and balances. I mean, there could be and there should be, like I said earlier, like the Washington State Attorney General, I think should really be paying attention. IRS and Congress could be stepping in. And then there is just the kind of like democratic people power. I'm talking to people in Seattle who are very upset. I feel like this is such a Seattle story, and it's so cool for me to be talking to a Seattle audience right now. Yeah.
Well, from your lips to the ears of Seattle, hopefully this will be the start of some change. Listen, I gotta ask you this question because I've been dwelling on it in my own head a lot. It's a bit off the topic that we've been talking about, but the Epstein files have also brought to light this really sustained and bizarre and kind of frightening focus of Epstein on supporting research into what can only be called modern day eugenics, studies pointing to white racial superiority, a lot of investment in genetic engineering. Do you see any parallels between what the Gates Foundation has focused on in its own work in population health and population health science? And is it possible, do you think, that Epstein saw in Gates a kind of like minded philanthropist on these types of topics?
I don't know if it's the two of them are like-minded or that all the men in this space are like-minded.
Mm.
I do think that there's a certain social Darwinism certainly at play. I think that somebody like Bill Gates is sure that he deserves the kind of wealth that he has attained because he is uniquely talented and uniquely smart. Just like I really believe that Bill Gates thinks that through philanthropy, the Gates Foundation, he really is helping people. Even though, as I've argued, I think he's doing more harm than good, and I think of many people, experts and his intended beneficiaries would say the same. He really believes that he has the money, he has the unique talent and the smarts and the mission to really drive something like this. Um, so with the Gates Foundation's work, they have flirted with ideas around reproductive health that I think do flirt with eugenics at times. Gates seems obsessed with population and controlling the population of poor nations, particularly poor Black nations, having too many people. And they have put money into reproductive rights and access to contraceptives according to the logic of wanting to limit poor people's ability to have more children. And that the people I talked to when I was writing about this, they said the ultimate litmus test, if you're really a humanitarian concerned about this, is you would be helping women who have fertility issues to have children that they couldn't have. You'd be working on both sides of the equation, not just helping poor women have fewer children, but helping poor women have more children if they want to. And that the fact that the Gates Foundation really has not shown up for that kind of work, I think it is a red flag, and it certainly is part and parcel of the way. Um, that you could say that the foundation has, their work does kind of overlap with Epstein in some of this area. But, I haven't looked that deeply into. I think that, I think what Epstein was doing, you could say probably fairly was categorically different. But at the same time, I do think that there's a certain, yeah, a kind of big man mentality, and certain social Darwinism and survival of the fittest, and we're the best, and we deserve the kind of privileges and entitlements that we have as this kind of like uber class of men. So yeah, I do think that there is something there.
Yeah, no, we're sort of coming to the finish line here with our interview, Tim. Thanks for being so generous with your time today. But for instance, our state of Washington, we're about to have the millionaire's tax is going to go up for vote here pretty soon, and I can't tell you as a journalist how many emails I'm inundated with every single day from folks who claim that if we tax any millionaire or billionaire, it's going to destroy our economy and it's going to stifle innovation and yada yada yada. And I was very interested in something you brought up, that you were saying that tax scholars report that for every dollar a billionaire gives away, up to 74 cents would be otherwise paid in taxes, particularly to municipalities that are seeing budget crunches and budget shortfalls and so forth. And so, as it seems that not only is the public subsidizing philanthropies like the Gates Foundation, right? But I mean, it seems like we're subsidizing sort of billionaires' lifestyles and their whims, because as you point out in your work, and I think folks like Anand Gardieres has pointed out, he's the author of Winner Take All, that sort of talks about the rise in oligarchy and the issues with philanthropy. I begin to wonder, when can we sort of ever when will enough people wake up to maybe to the point of how much of a racket, quite frankly, philanthropy is and in some ways is deleterious to our society, that they take away they seem to actually extract more than they give.
Yeah. A funny side note about the book that you mentioned, Bill Gates actually blurbed it, and the book does not criticize Bill Gates really. So, that's kind of an interesting thing. But I think that's part and parcel of this sort of evolution of the sort of discourse around billionaires. For the longest time, Bill Gates is the ultimate counterpoint to criticism of the billionaire class. You're like, well, look at someone like Bill Gates. He's giving away all of his money. He's saving millions of lives. This point about the tax benefits we give to billionaire philanthropy, it's billions of dollars in public funds from American taxpayers and taxpayers around the world that end up going into subsidizing Bill Gates' philanthropic career. So I think that's scandalous. That's a problem. We should not be in any way supporting Bill Gates' philanthropic career. But to the extent that we have been, this is a clear trigger for accountability for regulators, state and federal regulators, to step in and say, a lot of this money you're spending is actually our money. We need some accountability over it. Um, the other thing interesting, since Trump got elected, I've been writing about this. Bill Gates is widely disliked among Trump's political base. He's like a very reviled figure. He's seen as this liberal icon, so that the political right does not like him. So since Trump got elected, I've been writing about the potential for Republican-controlled government to investigate him or the Gates Foundation. Um, and it was like 60 years ago that Congress last took a serious look at what wasn't then billionaire philanthropy, but big philanthropy, the millionaire philanthropy. So we're long, long overdue for Congress to take a look at philanthropy. And when that happened 50, 60 years ago, it was a similar thing happening. You had a right wing government looking at philanthropies that they thought were too liberal. So, if the Trump administration or the Republican controlled Congress were to investigate Gates, I'm sure it would be politicized. It would be political in nature. But one way or the other, we have to get to a point where the rules are changing. We never should have let the Gates Foundation become this powerful, $86 billion and growing, billions of dollars every year. It is shaping everything now from climate policy to AI regulation to agricultural policy to public health to public education. All of us have our own ideas about how to best address these public policies, but not all of us have an $86 billion private foundation that we can deploy to buy a seat at the Democratic decision-making table. So I do think that, as I mentioned before too, I'm really inspired by the growing public discourse around oligarchy, that American journalists now are using the word oligarchy to describe American businessmen, not just Russians. So I do think, and you can track it also back to, Occupy Wall Street and the 1%. It is an increasingly mainstream conversation now about whether we should abolish billionaires. How far this goes or how quickly we can accelerate it, I don't know, but I do think that the ingredients are there. Just more broadly, I think that most Americans are understanding very clearly how unequal our society is and how unequal our economy is. They're feeling this in a very personal level. So I do think that the ingredients are there for the kind of radical change that we need. So, like I said, I have to be optimistic, Marcus. But I don't know. How about you two?
This conversation gives me optimism for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I quote James Baldwin. I woke up this morning, so I guess I'm an optimist.
All right, that's good.
Well, Tim, thank you so much for taking the time to walk us through this, and to do it with such care and transparency. Um, we will be recommending both your recent Substack as well as your book to our listeners. And yeah, we hope to see you out here in Seattle again soon.
Yeah, I'll look you both up when I come out. Thank you
Please
so
do.
much
Yeah,
for
please
inviting
do.
me on the show. Yeah.
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 Thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Tim.
Nora, I have to say, like, Tim, eh, that was, in terms of somebody like unfiltered, speaking truth to power, has no more F's to give. Um, yeah, I don't know if there's anything else to say because he said it all.
Yeah, I mean, I do think he's a person who's been looking at the foundation and Bill Gates for long enough to kind of see through a lot of the BS. And there's a lot more BS there.
Yeah.
So I really recommend that people actually check out his book because there's a lot more there about the foundation itself and the kinds of impacts it has and hasn't had around the world.
Yeah, he was definitely a Cassandra in terms of, like, sort of in early person onto that there was trouble brewing, and, I will say it appears that time continues to prove him correct.
Yeah.
Um, that being said, leaving at least one problematic white male billionaire behind, what what is your 8 ounces of joy for this week, Norm?
My 8 ounces of joy this week is actually an opinion column from the New York Times, which I am
Wow.
not often able to say.
Say more, please.
By Michael Roth, who is the president of Wesleyan University. And he has been a really outspoken and very brave university leader, kind of in opposition to the Trump administration at a time when I think a lot of university leaders have sort of forgotten where their spines are. Um, and he wrote a column about an initiative that he and other universities have been leading to develop a new Freedom Summer for undergraduate students from all across the country, to sort of revive our democracy. Um, and they've gotten 400 different universities involved. And so students from so many different types of colleges and universities from all over the country are going to be joining this summer initiative to sort of reclaim our democracy and learn about on the ground grassroots democracy in the places where it matters the most. And at a time when it feels like there's so little that some of us can do every day to
Yeah.
like fight upstream, this feels really impactful and brilliant and important. And yeah, I'm hugely excited to see how this changes those students' lives and changes our communities for the better.
I don't know, Nora, that sounds like that woke indoctrination that, Dr. Dade Abe talked about, and you know what he said that you can do with it that indoctrination on that episode that he was, on.
That would not go in the New York Times opinion column.
No, you can only find that commentary on In the Meanwhile. That's why the folks support it. That's a great one, Nora. I will say for me, my 8 ounces of joy is a super quick one, but it's, the recent survey that came out that over half of Americans want to abolish ICE, and I say for me, like, 1, I mean, being able to get half of Americans agreement on anything these days is, a minor miracle, but I'll say, I think to me, it just speaks to the facts, and I know people are always like, what do protests actually do? What do protests actually do? What do the protests actually do?" I think, protests and seeing community members and just massive amounts of people out in the street. I mean, I do think that that leads to, changes and shifts in public opinion, which then can lead, hopefully, to changes and shifts in policy. And I will say, like, I think the fact that the survey showcased that over half of Americans want this to happen, I think is a direct result and a product of protests that have been sustaining around ICE. And so I will say, like, for anybody who's like, what does any of this actually do? However you protest, I think that it it is contributing to something, is contributing to change. Just because it doesn't do it overnight doesn't mean it isn't doing something over the medium to long term. And so
Yeah.
that's where what I derive joy from this week.
Yes. Yes. I love that. I noticed this week that one of my neighbors who has a Harris 2024 political sign up in his yard also now has a bunch of abolish ICE signs. And I was like, the sands are shifting.
It's the it's the radicalism, right? There's only 2 directions to go, right? I mean, either farther left or more to the right and center. So here we are. Uh, with that said, shall we sign off for the day?
It is as good a time as any. Folks, if you have spent this week refusing to let powerful men swap out one scandal for another and call it news, you too are doing the work. Keep clutching those receipts while they try to light them on fire.
Yes, we are so glad you are here and part of this community. If you like what we do here, please do consider donating or subscribing to help sustain this very much not billionaire funded work.
Thanks, as always, to our producer, Jessica Partnow, who in fact keeps us very accountable, and to our composer, Aham Aluo, whose vibes are far better than the Senate's these days.
You can find us on YouTube, Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky, as well as anywhere you get your podcasts. If you like this episode, please share it with someone who is still under the delusion that a good billionaire is coming to save us. They need this more than you do.
New episodes drop every Friday. Stay focused, stay angry, and don't let that dollar menu of destruction get you down. We will see you in the meanwhile.